Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad. Good.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The booster interval for recipients of Pfizer and AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccines has now been shortened to 3 months compared to 6 months previously. Now, this was in response to the accelerating spread of the Omicron variant. Mounting evidence has shown that the booster shots have successfully restored protection against the new variant. And the question is now, how do we ensure that the booster rollout is as successful as the first COVID-19 mass immunization program? And for eligible recipients to be able to make an informed decision about whether or not to receive a booster shot and what is the best vaccine type for them. So let's speak first to Dr. Kumita Tevadas. She's a virologist with University Science Malaysia. Dr. Kumita, how do we best understand what a booster shot is? I'm thinking, should we think of it as a full dose like the primary series and therefore it's a third or even fourth shot? Is that how we should be thinking about the booster?
That's a good question. So just to sort of talk a little bit about how we looked at different vaccines before Omicron. So WHO actually referred to the third shot as an additional dose for certain groups. If you're from the elderly group, someone who's immunocompromised. So basically, if you belong in the vulnerable group, that was considered an additional dose because that was sort of what was needed to actually be considered as the primary series. So if you had gotten your 2 doses earlier, what they found out was that, after about 10 weeks or so about close to 3 months, the antibody levels, the protection levels actually dropped about 50%. So, it was sort of a given that eventually this group would have needed an extra additional dose. Booster shots back then was sort of defined as, if you're in the healthy group, you're young, you're healthy, everything's okay. After getting 2 doses, the efficacy level would usually be around in the 90s. Maybe after a couple of months, it would drop to maybe still in the high 80s, but that was still generally okay. It's still very, it would provide a lot of protection. But of course, everything has changed with Omicron. So we do know that 2 doses are not sufficient, and you would require a third dose. So even though right now we do refer to it as the booster, I do think in a few weeks or maybe in a few months, it would probably be referred to as the third shot.
Kumita, where is the likely trajectory of this when we consider that variants will develop over time and and immunity will wane and the vulnerable will be at increased risk? Are we looking at a scenario where this becomes a biannual event? I mean, is that what is likely to happen?
I guess maybe I'll sort of rephrase your question a little bit. So is the question then, every time we have a new variant, would we need a booster shot? So yeah, are we sort of looking at every 3 months or every 6 months? Not necessarily. So in the context of, new variants, if we sort of, again, look back at what happened earlier during the pandemic, when we had, variants such as Alpha or Beta or even Delta, back then we actually didn't need a booster. 2 doses were actually sufficient. So it really sort of depends, how the virus evolves, what sort of mutations does the virus get, and that's actually key to how often we may need to take an additional dose or a booster. So just to sort of explain a little bit more, when we talk about mutations, it depends on how large of a change that causes onto the virus. So if you think of the outer layer of the virus as a coat, that's sort of what's most important for the vaccine to recognize. So say the original coat is this blue coat with gold buttons. And if the mutation just causes a tiny change, and so now you have yellow buttons, buttons, your vaccine would still likely work. But now if you have, a really big change, and now instead of a blue coat, you have a red coat, your vaccine may most likely not be able to recognize it anymore. And so, you may not be as well protected anymore. And that's actually what we saw with Omicron, which actually has more than 30 different mutations on its outer coat. And that's actually why we need this extra booster shot or this third shot right now to protect us better. So again, I think it does touch a little bit again on how the virus does evolve over time.
Okay. What is the science, Dr. Kumita, behind shortening the interval period? So from 6 months to 3 months. What is the thinking, the science, the evidence behind that?
Okay, so initially, again, with alpha, beta, and delta, what we found was that there was a very, very small drop. So if you recall earlier, I talked a little bit about how after 2 doses, your protection or your vaccine efficacy level is usually in the high 90s, regardless of the type of vaccines you got. And they did see a very slight drop in the healthy group. But again, even after 6 months, it was usually in the 80s or so. So that's relatively okay. That's quite good. But especially with Omicron, they realized that with 2 doses, even with the vaccines that did really, really well, such as AstraZeneca and Pfizer, there was actually a huge drop in protection, and this was almost immediate. So, suddenly there is this sort of need. It was sort of pretty crucial to get everyone boosted. And when they did boost people, what they saw was that it actually brought the levels back up to what was a more regular 2-dose regimen against the other variants. So right now, that's sort of the goal. We are trying to bring up everyone's protection level so it is higher, in the 70s or in the 80s, and that should protect us all quite well.
Dr. Kumita, I mean, we get vaccines for a range of diseases. Often it's just a one dose for the entirety of our lives. I think only think of the flu shots that you might get and your company might offer you, so on and so forth, as something that as vaccines that we might take on a more regular basis. Is COVID kind of unusual in that we now see, this constant talk about the need for vaccination and increasingly at shorter intervals?
Yes and no. So a bit of a long answer to that. I think, if we sort of compare it across different viruses, different diseases, it does sort of go back to how quickly can the virus mutate, and again, how long of a protection do we have against that? Most of the time, most viruses actually, the more common ones that we see, they don't mutate as quickly. The flu actually does mutate faster, but with the flu, there is this concerted effort by WHO to look at, what's going on, and it was sort of easy to come up with something new every year. In the case of COVID, I would say definitely with Omicron at least, it has sort of changed how we view a lot of things, because having more than 30 different mutations is a lot. There are a lot of theories as to why that happens, and some of it is definitely related to vaccine inequity, which is what's actually going on with COVID right now.
Right. Dr. Kumita, for the eligible recipients, I'm just wondering what we should be keeping in mind to make an informed decision. There's so much information out there, particularly misinformation. Sometimes you get a lot of these forwarded messages on WhatsApp, and suddenly everyone's a virologist and an expert in mixing and matching vaccines and the efficacy of vaccines. I'm wondering what we should bear in mind in terms of maybe thinking about vaccines and boosters and whether they're all kind of created equal. What advice would you give?
Okay. So I think there are sort of two different groups that I usually encounter when talking about mixing vaccines. There's one group who's always sort of who wants to know which is the best vaccine that they can take, whether as the two regimen series or whether as a booster. The answer to that is always the one that's offered to you the quickest and the soonest. And that's just because, say you are team AstraZeneca, but you may only get it 6 months from now. That means that 6 months of you being unprotected against Omicron. So that's quite risky. So, whereas if they're offering you Pfizer tomorrow, then sure, go ahead and get it. And then, of course, I think there's a lot of people who are quite hesitant about mixing vaccines. Again, Melissa, as you sort of pointed out, there's so much info out there, and it's hard to sort of suss out what's real and what's not. But just to sort of share, the very first time someone actually did mixing of vaccines actually goes way back to early March of last year. So it's actually been close to a year now. And what they did was they actually started with AstraZeneca and then moved on to Pfizer as the second dose. And in all the cases, it was completely safe and it actually provided better protection. And that sort of gave people the idea that mixing was actually okay. So of course, since then, a lot of other countries have looked at mixing of vaccines, and of course, WHO, different regulatory bodies as well. Sweden and Denmark, they did AstraZeneca and Pfizer or Moderna. Again, fantastic results. This was seen in more than 10,000 people. Countries like UAE, Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey, for example, they started with Sinovac or Sinopharm or CanSino, and then moved on to either Pfizer or AstraZeneca. But right now, overall, are all vaccines sort of created equal? In general, the blanket rule is if you are mixing, that's always better than taking the same vaccine type each time. Pfizer. Is versus Pfizer, Moderna, for example, that's slightly better. But overall, since the vaccine has evolved and since what we are dealing with right now is Omicron, the suggested recommended vaccine is actually Pfizer, and that's what Malaysia is currently practicing. But if you did take any of the other vaccines, AstraZeneca is sort of the second suggested vaccine. And this is not just Malaysia. This is, in the US, in UK, in Australia. So that's mostly based on the early data from South Africa, where they actually did show that the mRNA vaccines do perform better against Omicron.
Right. Dr. Kamita, thank you so much for joining us on the show and shedding some light on the matter. Virologist Dr. Kamita Tevadas there, and we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more about boosters after the break. We'll be back. Stay tuned. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. However, if you've just joined us on the show, tonight we're discussing the ongoing COVID-19 booster rollouts. Joining us now, we have Azrul Muhammad Khalib. He's the Chief Executive of the Galen Center for Health and Social Policy. Azrul, just observing conversations about boosters, I've noticed that most of these conversations have been tinged with, elements of confusion or ambivalence or even uncertainty. And I'm just wondering why there's been so much confusion over vaccine boosters. I mean, have you noticed that too? And what do you think can be done to improve this public messaging around boosters to help ensure information being conveyed clearly to the public?
Well, Melissa, initially the reason why there was confusion was because the Ministry of Health did not really communicate well to the public of the need or reason for having yet another vaccine jab. There was a general assumption that the 2 jabs would be it, and that we would avoid getting infected altogether, and B, we won't need another jab after that. But we've seen both assumptions being debunked by this coronavirus. So what can we be done better? What can be done better? Well, the public messaging and communications on boosters have very much improved since a couple of months ago. But the fact is that the global north or other countries are better adjusted to this because they regularly communicate on the need to have booster jabs for influenza or the flu, whereas we don't really do that as much. So, it's very much improved since it was some time back. So people are getting their shots right now as we speak.
Azrul, in many countries, I noticed that governments ask people to check with their primary healthcare provider, their GPs really, about what they should do and, what choices they should make and so on and so forth. But in Malaysia, it seems like Khairi Jamaluddin has become he's the GP for the nation. And we don't have a system or a culture where people go to their GPs for this, right? They go to GPs for a medical MC maybe, but they don't go to their GPs to get this kind of information. Is there something missing in our healthcare ecosystem that that creates problems in messaging because we're kind of totally reliant on government to talk to us when we actually have all kinds of other options?
Well, the reality, Sharad, is health literacy in Malaysia is low. A third of the population is actually suffering from low-level health literacy, in which they don't really necessarily understand the kind of information that is being communicated to them on the issue of health, and also it affects their ability to make informed decisions concerning their healthcare. And this is something that's been proven through the National Health Mobility Survey, which the government released a couple of years back. So it is helpful for the government to be able to be very clear and definitive in terms of what kind of recommendations that can be forwarded and how people can make decisions concerning which vaccine to take or why they should take a particular vaccine. So in a real sense, I'm glad that we have this kind of guidance from the government. But in other countries, though, it really is depending on individuals to make their own minds and their own choices on which vaccine to take.
Is that dangerous, though? I mean, in the age of misinformation and information overload, making the ultimate decision of what a vaccine for the booster shot requires, some scientific evidence, and as you mentioned, health literacy. And I'm just wondering, whether people should be given the choice of booster. I understand currently the default is Pfizer at the moment. Is that a decision that the government is making for us, or should we be given an array and then allowed to decide which vaccine suits us best?
Well, the decision or the recommendations that the government puts out really is based on the science and definitely the findings from studies that have been conducted, which allow us to make clear and definitive opinions as to which vaccines people should actually take. So it's not really a rubber in the dark, as it were, and it's something that changes from time to time based on our developments, the ongoing developments, but also the level of understanding of the disease. So I think it's quite all right for us to depend on the recommendations by the government. There's so much disinformation, misinformation regarding vaccines and vaccination. It's very important for people to be able to be confident and trust in the government to do that.
I guess, Azrul, the other thing that constrains government and public policy is just supply. Vaccine supply has always been an issue in COVID, with the pandemic, and what is available to us in Malaysia, I guess, will determine, the kind of choices there. But I do want to ask about just the thinking underscoring some of this, including the fact that we seem to have discarded this idea that they're vulnerable groups. We seem to treat the entire population as if they were vulnerable. I don't mean to infection, which potentially everybody can get, but to severe COVID, to hospitalization. Should we be thinking, as we look to the future, to limit these vaccine rollouts to those who are vulnerable rather than make it universal?
This is a really good point, and it's on an ongoing discussion that's going on right now, not just here in Malaysia, but around the world, it's a real privilege for us to be talking about boosters when the majority of the world's population are struggling to get at least one jab of a COVID-19 vaccine. There is real vaccine inequity which unfortunately we are now contributing to. So, but we need to be able to prioritize right now who gets the booster jab. And one of the vulnerable groups, you're going to be very surprised to hear this, is really now on who has been vaccinated with what vaccine. And I would include these people into this category because the term fully vaccinated now has evolved from what we understood previously. And it now includes people who should be receiving the booster jab, such as those who were vaccinated with the Sinovac vaccine, which we need to ensure that they get the booster jab to ensure that they're up to the level of the mRNA vaccines. So it's important that we are able to prioritize those who need to get the booster jabs, and it's not just for everyone. But it seems like for the government of Malaysia right now, the priority really is to be able to get everyone to receive at least one booster in the very near future. So it's a privilege.
I'm thinking about that, about the kind of evolving definition of fully vaccinated and what that would mean in the time of variants, not fully vaccinated versus unvaccinated, how we should be thinking about that as we add boosters to the series of vaccines that we get. And as well, everyone's on their personal timeline, right? Everyone took the vaccine at different times. So I'm just wondering, from a public health system's point of view, how do we overcome this complexity for a booster dose rollout?
Well, Melissa, I can tell you it's not great. The status of being fully vaccinated used to be a lot simpler to understand. 2 jabs, and that's it. But in the era of COVID-19, that term is getting a real beating in the school playground. Based on our current understanding of vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic COVID-19 of the Omicron variant and immunity levels, we find that after 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines, effectiveness drops to about 10% at around 20 weeks. Boosters with either the Pfizer or AstraZeneca vaccines are able to kick that back up into the high 60s or 90s, but that really depends on which variant of COVID-19 we're talking about. So for Sinovac, unfortunately, fully vaccinated for the moment means 2 doses of Sinovac and a boosted dose of the mRNA vaccine, which only brings it to the level equivalent to having 2 doses of the mRNA vaccine. So they will have to be prepared to have more booster jabs in the immediate future. But Melissa, Sharat, the reality is that just like how we deal with influenza or the flu, we are going to probably need more seasonal boosters, not just because of new variants, but also waning immunity. Now, you mentioned just now about personal timelines, right? The thing is, it is something that we need to actually look at right now, is that in order for this rolling out of boosted doses to be successful, the public needs to be confident and trust that the health authorities know what they're doing. COVID-19, as mentioned, I think Sharat, you mentioned just now, is moving the goalposts of existing understanding, and we often need to be flexible and change our actions to reflect that. And unfortunately, I have to say to you, Melissa, there are no shortcuts or tricks to get there quickly. The health system needs to continue to communicate informed so that people will make their own decisions on whether or not to get vaccinated, if they haven't still been vaccinated, or in this case, get the booster jab.
Azrul, on that point, does the health system, and when we know this is true, I mean, it's a rhetorical question, need a booster itself? And some lessons we've learned, we've talked to you before about decades of underinvestment, the disappointment, I think, when we had you on for the 12th Malaysia Plan, and yet another study commissioned when a study had been commissioned before and then promptly ignored. Are we seeing a concerted effort to boost the health system so it can deal with this virus, rather than constantly reach for vaccines and stuff as the panacea for our problems?
Sharat, this is a really good question. I really do hope that some of the policymakers are listening in, because the fact is that despite the health allocation for 2022 being the largest ever and being the second largest allocation under the federal budget, we are still underfunding health. And when you look against GDP and also other countries of similar economic status. And the reality is, it does seem like we are very often catching up. We're trying to catch up with what other countries perhaps are already being able to do in their stride. For example, the genotyping of COVID-19, which unfortunately we're not able to do as frequently or as many as we like. And the reality here is that we need good science in order to make the best possible decisions. And right now, we are very much depending on the data and studies from other countries, in addition to that in Malaysia, to inform the government on current recommendation of what needs to be done in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, including the performance of the vaccines we use here in Malaysia. And every week, there are new findings and surprises. I slapped my forehead in frustration, when I read the UK study, whose findings I cited a moment ago, especially the implications regarding future boosters. So how to make informed decisions? The same studies that are available to the government are available to you and I. If you want to read the summary of the studies I mentioned just now, just go to Code Blue, our health news portal, to read them and decide on whether to receive the booster vaccine and what booster to take. So I'm just saying, Ministry of Health has done very well.
Okay. Azra, thank you so much. Yes, thank you for being on the show tonight. Azra Muhammad Khalid from the Galen Center there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you for watching and good night.
Good night.